The arrest warrant was already in the sheriff's hand when Doc Holliday's cough cut through the room dry and sharp, like a reminder that his time was its own kind of law. The man with the badge glanced at the handkerchief Doc gripped between his fingers, then at the holster on his hip, as if deciding which threat was more real. "John Henry Holliday, you're coming with me. Now." Doc didn't argue, didn't ask for mercy, didn't explain himself. He just lifted his eyes, too thin for his own clothes, and smiled with a calmness that irritated people. Because a man about to die shouldn't smile when he's also about to hang. And that's when the question settles in the chest of anyone watching. Was that smile courage, or just a man who had already given up on saving himself? The sheriff didn't want conversation. He wanted a gesture, a mistake, a movement that justified force. And Doc knew it. He had spent his life reading men across poker tables, understanding the exact moment when a man decides to be cruel. The West didn't need monsters. It only needed a tired citizen with authority strapped to his waist. Doc slid his hand toward the glass, not the gun. He drank slowly, as if time belonged to him. Then, he set the glass down on the counter and said quietly, "If I go, they'll say I confessed." The sheriff replied without looking at him, "If you don't, they'll say you tried to run." Doc gave a half smile. "Barely anything. So in the end, what I do doesn't change the story." That's when the sheriff realized what bothered him about the man. Doc Holliday didn't seem afraid of death. He seemed familiar with it, like he spoke to it every morning. And that made any accusation feel weaker. The town called it justice, but Tombstone's justice was nervous, quick fingers on the trigger. It was also justice that could be bought with whiskey, with fear, with loyalty. And Doc, sick as he was, had a way of reminding people of that truth. Some called him a doctor, some a dentist, some a gambler, some a killer. He had been all of those things, or close enough. But there was one thing he could never be: invisible. He came west with a diploma and a sentence in his lungs. Tuberculosis wasn't just a disease, it was a calendar, a clock without hands, but merciless all the same. What does a man do when he realizes death isn't a possibility? It's a neighbor. Some become saints. Some become drunks. Some become cowards. Doc became a walking question. He walked like a man with no future, but he spoke like a man who still chose. The warrant that night wasn't just about a crime. It was about a name. They said Doc had sparked what happened near the OK Corral, said he loved trouble too much, said he wanted to die and take someone with him. And maybe that was the sin the town couldn't forgive. A man who didn't beg to live. Doc looked at the paper like it was a bar tab. "You believe this?" he asked, pointing at the warrant with his chin. The sheriff didn't answer. Outside, the street carried that kind of silence that only happens when everyone is waiting for something to break. Then Doc did the most dangerous thing a man can do in the West. He smiled again. Not a joking smile. A decided one. "I'll go." Within 2 minutes, the whole town would know. Doc Holliday didn't run. The sick man didn't flee. And in the West, that was more scandalous than any shootout. Because running made sense. Fear was normal. Denial was human. But a man who walks toward his own sentence disturbs other people's guilt. On the way to the jail, someone shouted from the sidewalk, "You think you're gonna die pretty, Doc." Doc paused just long enough to turn his head. "Not pretty," he said, "but the same way I lived, without asking permission." And he kept walking. The sheriff quickened his pace. He didn't like that kind of talk, not because it was a threat, but because it sounded true. In the cell, the air smelled like iron and bad decisions. Doc sat carefully, like a man who knew his body well enough to understand his chest couldn't handle bravado. The cough came again. He controlled it, swallowed it, breathed through his nose. When the sheriff shut the door, Doc said without looking at him, "You're afraid of me." The sheriff gave a short laugh. "I'm afraid of what you bring. You ride with men who make enemies easy." Doc tilted his head slightly. "You mean the Earps?" The sheriff didn't answer, but the name hung in the air like gunpowder without a spark. Wyatt Earp, Virgil Earp, Morgan Earp. Men trying to be law in a land that took law as a personal insult. And Doc was the unlikely ally. A sick man living off cards and whiskey, standing beside men who claimed to defend order. The West was always full of contradictions. From a distance, you might think Doc followed Wyatt out of friendship. But friendship doesn't explain everything. Friendship doesn't make a sick man step into a fight that could end in a noose. Friendship doesn't make someone choose the worst place to die. What Doc had with Wyatt was something else. A silent pact between two men who knew the world wasn't fair and still refused to hand it over to chaos. Wyatt had health and a future. Doc had disease and a closing horizon. And still, Doc was the one who smiled. When Morgan Earp fell, the West grew colder. Not because death was new, but because this time it had a familiar face. Wyatt changed inside. Virgil carried the scars. The family cracked. And Doc, already carrying his own sentence, felt something else grow. A loyalty that wasn't romantic. It was heavy. The kind of loyalty that collects a debt. The kind that moves a man from defense to vengeance. And this is where the hardest truth about Doc Holliday begins. It's easy to turn him into a hero. A brave invalid. A loyal friend. But the West didn't keep anyone clean. Doc rode with Wyatt when things went dark, when the line between justice and retaliation grew too thin to see. And the question from the beginning shifts without you noticing. Maybe Doc's smile wasn't only courage. Maybe it was also a mask. A way of not looking directly at what he was becoming. Years later, when the desert tightened around him, Doc went to Colorado looking for a different kind of air. Glenwood Springs wasn't paradise. It was a final wager. He arrived a week older than his years. Still young on paper. But his body had moved on without him. And yet he carried the same thing he always had. The ability to smile where others saw only despair. Not out of joy, out of clarity. In his last days, a man who had lived by risk was finally confined to a bed. No horse, no poker table, no saloon noise. Just his lungs, just silence. That's where the myth dies and the man remains. And that's where the first question demands its answer. Was Doc's smile courage or surrender? Now there was no audience, no enemy, no Wyatt. Just him. Just God, if God existed the way the West whispered but never proved. On his final morning, someone entered the room and saw Doc staring at his own feet. He had always imagined dying in his boots, the way men die who never stop moving. But there he was, barefoot in a bed. And that small, ordinary detail cut through the last bit of theater. He looked at the empty space where his boots should have been, and he smiled. A weak smile, but a real one. As if he finally understood that death didn't need to follow the script he had written for himself. There was no duel, no music, no main street, just a room. Short breaths, surrender. And in that smile, if you look closely, you'll find the answer. Doc didn't smile because he gave up on life. He smiled because he gave up pretending he was in control. Death didn't catch him smiling because he loved dying. It caught him smiling because he had faced the end so many times. that when it came without spectacle, he recognized the only victory left. He couldn't choose to live longer, but he could choose not to be ruled by fear. And maybe that's the kind of courage the West rarely saw. A sick man. No future. No guarantees. Still determined not to tremble inside. Not because he was strong, but because, finally, he was honest. And now the last question remains quiet, without a ready-made moral. When your end comes the wrong way, without the setting, without the warning, without the boots you thought you needed, will you smile out of faith, or just so you don't cry?